Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Sticky Buns. That's right, the first recipe I ever made for my family after coming home after my first semester at culinary school was Sticky Buns. And to be honest, I don't remember how they came out, although I do remember everyone enjoying them, or at least pretending to. And ever since then, they've had a special place in my heart, which is why it's so astounding I've never done a video for these. But hey, at least that gave me time to perfect the recipe. And perfect I did. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with our dough, which will begin with some very warm water, as well as some very warm milk, over which we will sprinkle 1 package of dry active yeast. And what we like to do is wait about 10 minutes to see if it's active, which it always is, as indicated by those little bubbles around the edge. And then to this we will add some white sugar, 1 large beaten egg, and a whole bunch of melted butter. And then we'll go ahead and take a whisk and give this a quick mix before finishing up with our flour and salt. Except when I went to do that, something very, very rare occurred. Right, it only happens once every like 200 videos, which is I thought the camera was on, but I must have double-clicked it and it was really off. So you don't get to see me add it in. But so you don't miss anything, let me show you how it looked. All right, I added the flour with this bowl, and then I used a small ramekin to add the salt. And that's it. Now that you're all caught up, we can grab our dough hook and give this a few stirs for no apparent reason before we head to the mixer to create our dough. And as usual, I did not add all the flour in. Okay, I like to add in about 75% of it and then give that a mix. And then once the mixture looks like this, which is clearly way too loose, we can go ahead and add some more in. And we'll continue doing that until all the flour's in or we've added enough to make this come together. And when I say come together, I don't mean into a tight ball of dough. I'm talking just barely come together to form a very, very extremely soft dough. At which point we will let this knead for about 5 minutes. After which it should look a little something like this. And if you're thinking that looks like it's too loose to work with, well, it sorta is. But if you want the world's best sticky buns, this is what we have to deal with. And as you'll see, it's going to be fine. So we'll go ahead and pull that off the mixer and scrape down our hook. And then let me go ahead and give this a few turns with the spatula so you can get a good idea what the texture should look like. And even though this is very loose and very sticky, as you can see, we built up enough gluten where this really does kind of hold together. And then what we're supposed to do at this point is transfer this into a nice clean bowl that we rub lightly with oil. But you know what? I'm going to skip that step and just let it rise in this bowl. It's going to be fine. And then all we need to do is cover this and let it rise in a warm spot for about an hour or so, or until it doubles in size. And while we're waiting, we will move on to make our sticky nut topping, which is going to start with some light brown sugar, some regular white sugar, a small but very important touch of salt, as well as a whole bunch of melted butter, and then a few tablespoons of water. And then once all that's in there, we'll go ahead and give this a very thorough mixing with a spatula, or maybe a whisk would work even better. But the point is, go ahead and mix that until smooth. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and transfer that into a very well buttered metal baking pan. And yes, that is my Detroit pizza pan. But as long as it's metal and about 13 by 9, it will work. And you can, and I have, done this in a glass pan. But if you can, try to use metal because it does seem to work a little better. And then what we'll do once we have that spread out evenly is sprinkle over a very generous cup of chopped pecans. And for whatever reason, if you're not into pecans, you could use walnuts, which are also very nice in this. So use what you want. I mean, you guys are, after all, the Jabba the Hutts of your sticky nuts. But personally, I think the sweeter and richer pecan works the best here. And that's it. Once those have been evenly applied, we will simply set that aside until needed. And we'll move on to mix up the last component, which is simply a cinnamon spice brown sugar that we'll use to spread over our dough before we roll it up. So we'll go ahead and give that a good mix, and we'll set that aside and then go check our dough, which after about an hour or so should look a little something like this. And a lot of times we would punch it down at this point just for fun. But don't even bother, because what we're going to do with very, very well floured fingers is go ahead and transfer this onto a lightly floured surface. And then somehow, some way, using just enough flour so it doesn't stick to our hands, we're going to press it and stretch it out into a big rectangle. And yes, it will and is sticking to the table, which is fine. Okay, because this dough is so elastic and has so much butter in it, even though it will kind of stick to the counter, as you'll see when we start rolling this, it should release and come off fairly cleanly. And if it doesn't, you can blame me. And if you want to try to use a roller, go ahead. But I think a couple flat floured hands are the best tools. And by using your hands, even though we are flattening this out fairly thin, we're not pressing out all the tiny bubbles like a rolling pin might. And then what we'll do once that is into a rectangle about, I don't know, let's say 18 by 15, something like that. We'll go ahead and sprinkle over our cinnamon brown sugar mixture. And it's fine to go all the way to the ends, but along the two longer edges, we should probably leave about 1 inch to 2 inches unsugared, so the dough seals when we roll it up. And then once that's been applied, we'll give it a light pressing with our hands, just to sort of make sure it's all evenly distributed, and press down a little bit into the dough, at which point we can start rolling this up. And because this dough is so sticky and soft, this will be the most challenging part of the recipe. And by challenging, I mean fun and exciting. And as I mentioned earlier, because of the elasticity and high fat content in the dough, it really should come up fairly easily and pretty clean. But where that stickiness will cause issues is with your fingertips. All right, so make sure you keep those floured as necessary, so that somehow, some way you can roll this up into a nice, fairly even cylinder. And then what we'll do once that is totally tubular, and we've given that one last shaping with our hands to make sure it's as uniform as possible, we'll take the edge of a knife and score this into 12 equal portions. But we are just making marks. We are not going to cut this with a knife. All right, this dough is so soft, it would be really, really hard to cut with a knife, which is why what we'll do is take a piece of string and slide it underneath until it reaches the appropriate spot. And then we'll simply cross the ends and pull in opposite directions, which, as you can see, will do a beautiful job cutting this dough fairly neatly. And I'm just using regular kitchen string here, but some unflavored dental floss will also work, and maybe even better. And that's it. Once cut, we'll go ahead and transfer those into our pan, making 3 rows of 4 buns each. And by the way, when you place these in, if one side has a little thicker dough than the other, place the doughier side up. Okay, if you can't tell the difference, it doesn't matter. And what's going to happen here is once these are baked, we're actually going to flip the pan over so that our sticky nut mixture ends up being on the top. And in the business, we call this topping from the bottom. So whatever you think the best looking side is, place that down against the nuts. And then before we can bake these, what we're going to do is tent these loosely with foil and let them rise for about 45 minutes to an hour, or until they almost double in size. And sure, you could use plastic wrap if you want, but if we use the foil, we can also use that later in the oven if they're getting too brown. But anyway, the point is cover those and let them rise for about an hour, or until they look like this. And that's it. Once these have been proofed, as we call it, they are ready to transfer into the center of a 375-degree oven for about 35 minutes or so, or until they reach an internal temp of 200 degrees. And as I mentioned, near the end of the baking time, if they look like they're getting too brown, go ahead and pop that foil on, which I did for the last 5 minutes. But anyway, this is what mine look like after 35 minutes, which are beautiful as is, but they're going to get even more so. And then what we'll do at this point is let those sit on a rack for exactly 5 minutes. All right, no more and no less. Because if you flip these too soon and it's too loose, things might slide out and get messy. But if you wait too long and the sugar hardens, they might not come out at all. So we'll leave them on that rack exactly 5 minutes, at which point we will very carefully, but with extreme confidence, flip these over onto a platter, revealing one of the greatest sights in all the culinary world. I mean, come on, look at that. And then what we'll do after our successful dismount is take a spoon and transfer any of those sticky nuts that were left in the pan back on top of our buns, into whatever spot we can see some are missing. And that's it. All we need to do at this point is let them cool down a little, ideally until they're just warm, at which point we can go in for a taste. And even though this looks like one giant sticky bun, they will generally separate fairly easily, as you can see. And as you bite into this thing, you will finally understand why we wanted that dough so soft and so sticky. Because the texture of these is going to be so impossibly light and airy, but still with just that perfect amount of slight chewiness. And had we added more flour into the dough to make it easier to work with, we would not be experiencing nearly the same bun. Okay, it's definitely been my experience with baking that the harder a dough is to work with, the better it comes out. Which is sort of the same thing with people sometimes. And of course, the contrast between that beautifully tender, airy dough and that sweet, crunchy, sticky topping is just otherworldly. And by the way, that corner piece I tore off first, I think was one of the doughier pieces, and probably was an end piece. So here, for the sake of science, I plated up another one so I could cut it in half and show you how, if properly rolled, you're going to see those beautiful layers of dough and cinnamon sugar. So not to pat myself on the back, but this really did come out perfectly in every way. And having said that, even imperfect sticky buns are still amazing. So don't be discouraged if you have a few issues the first time you try this, like I'm sure I did back in 1981. But whether these come out perfectly, or your family just tells you they did, I really do hope you give these a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.